So our first presenter is Victoria Castle, who is now at the University of Chichester, but was at the University of Oxford.
Yes.
And your presentation is on developing neurodiversity affirming measures of parenting. Thank you so much, Victoria, and I will just pass over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm Victoria Castle. So today I just wanted to talk about a couple of parenting measures that our team at Oxford co-developed with parents that aim to be inclusive of neurodiversity. Are my slides moving forward okay? Is that working? Yeah. Great.
Perfect.
So, yeah, great. Let's check. So firstly, I just want to talk about the background of the project, so why we engaged in this project. And then I'm going to talk through development of a parent-child interaction measure, and then a parental self-efficacy measure as well. So this project came from, the context is there is an intervention that Dr Alex Hendry is running, and that aims to support children with a family history of autism or ADHD in their executive functioning skills. And so that group has a community advisory group, and basically the community advisory group said, we don't like the idea of you judging us on our parenting. And when Alex asked the community advisory group, what is it that you don't like? They said, we're a bit worried that you can be judging us on our parenting because our parenting may look different from neurotypical parents. So parenting measures are really commonly used in developmental research, and they're quite often used when either the parent or child is neurodivergent. And by neurodivergent, I mean autistic or has ADHD or sort of another neurotype other than sort of neurotypical. And what we find is that this research can actually have a really big impact on society's views. And that can sometimes be a bad thing if the research is not done sort of accurately. So what you find historically, there have been some theories, some causal theories of autism, for example. So there are theories from Leo Kanner and Bettelheim came up with the idea of refrigerator mothers, where they both suggest that autism is caused by mothers being really emotionally cold or really negatively controlling. And although we've sort of moved away from these causal theories for autism, there's still research that's being engaged in that's making associations between parents who are sort of showing perhaps negative controlling behaviours and autism in children. But it's unclear how appropriate the measures used in these studies actually are for these populations. And it may be that actually, if measures are really heavily relying on behaviours that are less frequently seen during natural interactions between neurodivergent dyads, that actually it may unfairly discriminate against these families. So, for example, if the parenting measures are particularly looking for smiling or eye contact or hugging, for example, as indicators of emotional warmth, then perhaps you don't naturally see this so much where either the parent or the child is neurodivergent. Perhaps that's not what a healthy interaction between that a neurodivergent dyad looks like. And so research has actually found that families with neurodivergent children may need to show different parenting behaviours than families with neurotypical children. And there's also very little research that's been conducted on neurodivergent or parents who are neurodivergent themselves as well. So currently it's really difficult to know how accurate any conclusions made from research using such measures are, because it may be that neurodivergent families are being unfairly scored as showing less than optimal parenting behaviours. Equally, very little research is actually examining parental self-efficacy within neurodivergent families. And by parental self-efficacy, I mean sort of a parent's belief that they are able to sort of successfully parent that child. And no measures currently have taken into account the really specific experiences that may be unique to this neurodivergent population either. So our aim of this project then was to co-develop with the community an observational parent-child interaction measure and a self-report parental self-efficacy measure, which could be both appropriate for the population and also acceptable to that neurodivergent population. So we had several phases for both of the measure developments. But for today, I'm going to be focusing on the parts that are shown here in green. So these are the aspects of the measure developments that specifically included going to the community and asking what they wanted from a measure. So firstly, with our parent-child interaction measure development, we started with some focus groups. So these were all over Teams, and we had 2 sets of focus groups. So we had one sample of parents who were either neurodivergent themselves or who had a child who's neurodivergent. And then we had a separate sample of academics with relevant research experience. And by relevant research experience, I mean experience using parent-child interaction measures with sort of young children under the age of 6. And so for both these groups, we asked them to think about different possible features of parent-child interaction measures, specifically trying to keep in mind how you might need to adapt a measure to make sure that it is neurodiversity affirming, but also just to give their overall experiences of parenting or experiences of applying parent-child interaction measures to families. And we asked them to reflect on parenting constructs, on the types of coding that could be used, and the setting and context that the measures could take place in. What we found was that both parents and academics found that it was most helpful to focus on positive parenting constructs that you can encourage parents to engage in. So, for example, responsiveness, as opposed to sort of negative constructs such as hostility. The academics were split on the types of coding they preferred. So half of them preferred microcoding, which is when you focus on specific behaviours. So you might be counting every time a parent smiles, for example, each time they give physical contact. Or if they preferred macrocoding, which is when you take a more sort of globic, holistic approach. And you have a scale, for example, from 1 to 5, and you're saying within a certain time frame, was the parent showing sort of 4 out of 5 for emotional warmth, for example. So academics completely split because there are pros and cons of each approach. But what came up in all of the focus groups was the importance of taking the context into account. So seeing how the child responds, being the importance of flexibility of the measure to be able to consider individual differences. And this particularly came up for the parents. So parents found they thought it's really important that actually parent-child interactions can look different between families, and that's okay. They don't have to look identical. And so because of this sort of push for flexibility, we felt that perhaps a macro coding approach might be slightly preferred by this group. So macro coding, again, is that global approach of a scale as opposed to looking at specific behaviours. The academics noted that it is trickier to compare free play settings. So if you're just letting children and parents have sort of free range over what they're doing, but it is more naturalistic, and parents preferred the idea of free play rather than a set structured task for the child, because it may be that the child just doesn't want to engage in a particular task. So parents really preferred the idea of a free play setting. And one thing that's really important that came up, particularly for the parents, but also for some academics as well, was how important it was that the setting does not elicit unnecessary distress. And so for some parents, they said that they would prefer a home setting for this reason, where possible. But some of the parents actually said that it's not that it needs to take place in home. It could take place in lab, but as long as some adjustments are made to make sure that the the likelihood of distress is reduced or removed. So we asked them what they could suggest themselves for how we could sort of reduce distress for children coming into the lab. And they suggested things like social storybook. So that's the idea of having sort of information about what the family are going to come across before they get to the study. So from here on in, we started using electronic sort of booklet about our lab and what it looks like, what sort of toys they could expect. We also gave parents at this point the opportunity to say, oh, I don't like that toy, that wouldn't be appropriate for my child for this reason, and we could adjust the setup there. It also told them about us, who we are, what we look like, and so what to expect. And so that, and similarly, parents also suggested the idea of using pre-study lab visits, either in person or electronically. And again, the reason for this was to sort of reduce anxiety about the unknown. So giving them as much information as possible before they get there. They also suggested the use of sensory rooms. So what we did again for all of our in-person research after this point was to use, so we bought some sensory toys and dedicated one room as a sensory room, and let families know that if the child needed a sort of a breakout room, take some time out where they weren't being filmed, that they could absolutely do that. And we had the sensory room set up that, to be honest, they were always very excited by our toys, and so we never actually needed the sensory room, but it was great to have the parents' suggestion of having that there available. So what we did next was we engaged in something called reflective narrations. So if you've heard of video elicitation interviews, it's similar to that. But what we did here was, so we got the parents in with the children and made sure that both child and parent all settled in and happy playing. And when the parents said they were ready to start recording, we recorded for roughly 20 minutes. And then we got the parent to watch back their video of them and their child playing together. And we asked them to narrate what they felt stood out as important. And the reason we did this, and we thought it's really important to do this, was because we know that, you know, we actually have a neurodiverse team ourselves. We know that even for those of us who are neurodivergent or have children who are neurodivergent in the team, that we are researchers and we have been educated by theories that may be sort of deficit-based and may actually, we may have been biased ourselves in what we look for when we watch parent-child interaction videos. And so what we wanted to do is ask parents themselves to sort of reflect on if there's any instances or any particular behaviours that we don't think to look for as researchers, because we've been biased by sort of previous academic experience that might actually be sort of unhelpful in some ways. And so, yeah, we asked parents to then sort of highlight what they thought was most important to sort of look for in an interaction. And we also asked them, because of these parents and academics highlighted that responsive parenting might be something helpful to look for in a measure, we specifically asked them what responsive parenting might look like for their family. And in all cases, they picked out examples from our videos of sort of good examples of when they felt, oh, this is when I'm being particularly responsive here, which gave us a really nice example, really nice, actual clear examples for us. And in some cases, organically, parents offered suggestions of, maybe I could have been more responsive here. Here's where perhaps I wasn't noticing this cue. And that was really helpful to actually come organically from the parents as well. And we also asked if this is sort of typical for them and how parenting may sort of look different for other families as well. So we had 4 parents for this who were all either neurodivergent themselves or had a child who's neurodivergent or both, where the children were aged 18 to 36 months. And we engaged in thematic analysis to see what came up from that. And what we saw were these really clear key themes of that parents felt that they should be following the child's lead of play, that they should not just be following their lead, but also building on that play, enhancing their child's play, and also showing their engagement in the play and availability. So sometimes they said the children like to engage in solitary play, and that's fine. But that's something that came up a bit, that perhaps with neurodivergent children, perhaps they enjoy playing, engaging in solitary play more than neurotypical families. But actually, in those cases, when the child wants to engage in solitary play, it's not appropriate for the parents to sort of force interaction. And so it's more about showing the child that I'm available for play interaction if you want that, and giving those cues to the child. Parents also gave us some really nice examples for cues that they look out for from their child, and examples of how they provide feedback back to their child. And in both cases, this included both verbal and non-verbal cues for us. And it's really something the parents found was really important, was that we really acknowledge that cues can look quite different between families. So there's a lot of individual differences, but also not just between families, but also within families, even within the same dyad. Sometimes what a good interaction looks like can look like one thing, and perhaps a month later, actually the child decided that, no, this is how I want to interact now. And so that can change. So it's taking the context into account is really important. So seeing how the child is responding to the parent's behaviours. So we developed a responsive parenting measure that took into, looked at how much the parent follows the child's lead, builds on play, and shows how much they showed the child that they were either engaged in the play or available to play. We tried to make this measure really versatile, to take into account individual differences, and we tried to make sure the setting was appropriate and wouldn't cause sort of unnecessary distress by taking into account the suggestions from the parents. For the parental self-efficacy development, we also use focus groups. So again, we had two sort of samples. So we had a sample of parents who, again, were either neurodivergent or had a child who was neurodivergent, or in most cases both. And then we had a separate sample of practitioners with relevant experience. By this I mean, so either they had a background in speech and language therapy, or they'd run parent-toddler groups. And so we asked the parents to discuss their experiences of parenting when their child is a toddler, and we asked the practitioners to discuss experiences of supporting their families, specifically in toddlerhood as well. And we asked both groups to specifically reflect on the idea of neurodiversity and if that made any difference as well. And so what came up from these focus groups was sort of 5 key themes of managing how others understand and respond to my child's needs, treating my child as an individual, being aware of my own knowledge and expectations as a parent, coping with the demands of parenting, both emotional and physical, and problem solving. And so initially 62 items were developed, either directly ourselves from on the basis of the focus group data, or they were selected from relevant existing measures where they fit into these themes and were just very appropriate and already well phrased. And these were then reduced down later through a couple of series of stages of refinement. So we had 42 items. One of these stages of refinement actually included a live annotated read through from parents of toddlers. So as we went through, we'd ask them, does this make sense? So like, is there anything that's not clear? And ask them if they could easily answer the question, or if there's any that they just wouldn't understand, they wouldn't know how they would respond to that. And so we also asked a panel of developmental psychologists similar things. Is there anything that doesn't quite tap into what we're trying to tap into again? So we refined that down to 42 items. And then we did a sort of fancy factor analysis called ESCM, and that suggested that there were 4 subscales that could be used, and they roughly mapped onto the first 4 of these themes, with the problem-solving items basically covering each of those first 4 themes as well. So now we have 2 measures that we've developed with the community. So we've got the inclusive assessment of parent-child interaction, and we've got the parental self-efficacy and barriers questionnaire. So what we want to do now is test if they're associated with each other, and test if they're also associated with executive functioning, as we would expect. So previous measures, you would typically expect them to be associated. We want to see if these ones are. And we also want to validate these measures in larger, more diverse samples, because we are aware that, particularly for the parent-child interaction measure, where we mainly had parents coming in person around the Oxford area, it's quite a high SES sample, mainly very white sample. We actually had more fathers than we would expect, which was great to see from a developmental study, way more fathers than we typically get from developmental studies. But it wasn't the most diverse sample. So what we would love to do now is, if any researchers out there would like to help us to help validate these measures in a sort of larger, more diverse sample, that would be great. So if you are interested in using our measures, come speak to us. We'd love that, because we want to make sure that these measures are definitely appropriate to use, not just for a particular group of neurodivergent individuals, but sort of appropriate use for a very diverse group. I just want to acknowledge the START team, particularly Dr. Alex Hendry, but also Victoria Hulks and Martina Smith, who led on the parental self-efficacy development, and also all the parents who took part in each stage of this research, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to create these measures. Their insights have been insanely invaluable. Yeah, I'd love to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And you were almost bang on 20 minutes. I mean, I don't know if you prepared that and practiced, but it was spot on, which is never easy. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I think both in terms of the research approach that you adopted, as well as the findings as well. Hopefully all our attendees are able to put comments and questions into chat. So please do, if you have any questions for Victoria,
be great.
That would be really helpful. And if no questions are coming through, I suspect it's probably something to do with some settings rather than because I think there's lots of lovely things. While questions may be coming through, I wonder if you can tell me, you clearly had a very inclusive approach to the research and both the analysis as well, which we often don't see. So yeah, can you tell me a little bit about that design to get to that point?
Okay, so Curator Advisory Group have just been amazing, basically. So they're always happy to sort of suggest approaches and how we can be more inclusive. Also, Dr. Alex Hendry and our head of lab group at Oxford, Guy Sharif, are both very passionate about engaging in inclusive research. So it's been wonderful working with them, as getting ideas and sort of kind of participatory research methods that be used. I think mainly we just all learn from each other. So I've just been trying to read up as much as possible from what other people are doing, but there's always more that we can do, and there's always things that, I look back at this research and think, we could have done this, we could have done more. There's always more that can be done, which is, well, it's exciting in this field, but that's why we have these talks, so that we can sort of share ideas for how we can engage in more methods. So if people have more ideas for what we could have done better, that would also be great.
I know, absolutely. It is hearing ideas of other people and developing from there. So so we have some questions, and thank you for attendees who reminded me that I should be looking in the Q&A and not in the chat. So thank you. So got a question from Christine, who's asked, is there well, a couple of questions, but from Christine, but I'll give you one at a time. Is there a move towards automatically assessing the parents for neurodivergence? Because many are missed or misdiagnosed.
So assessing the parents for neurodivergence, is that?
Yes, yeah.
So, so for our research, we didn't. We're not clinical psychologists. We can't give diagnoses. Diagnosis is the wrong word. I hate that word. It's so clinical. But we completely relied on self-report for this research. I think a lot of time what we're getting from parents who are in our focus groups and so on is that they're finding out that they're neurodivergent because their children have been given a diagnosis, and they're finding out more about themselves. We're also finding that some of the parents who are engaging in the research didn't realise they were neurodivergent at the beginning, and then after thinking about it and reading sort of the process, have since said, "Oh, actually, I might be neurodivergent." I think there are pros and I think there are pros and cons of doing it. I think that, well, I think most people, I guess, would be quite happy to sort of if they're already engaging in the research, to sort of learn more about their own traits, I suppose. A lot of the time, to be honest, when people are engaging in the research, they're more likely to be neurodivergent because, yeah. Anyway, but I know that they're neurodivergent.
Yeah, as you said, there are pros and cons in it, but as you say, people who are drawn to support the research, hopefully, yeah. And another question from Christine: what's the role of the child's consent? When are they consulted? And too many studies just get one of the parents to sign off, which I think a child's distress should be a factor, and especially if they are non-speaking.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess it's at a certain age in psychology research, we use what's called assent forms. At the age that we're conducting this research, we don't do that as standard, because children are too young, sort of, to some of the new form to sort of think about it in those ways. But what we do try to do as researchers is to gauge if there's if the child's in distress, but also I guess there's only so much we can judge for ourselves because the parent theoretically knows the child best. So we're mainly relying on the parent and saying to the parent, if your child's distressed, it's absolutely okay to pull out the study and not engage in this. That's okay. This isn't compulsory. But and I guess it does become more difficult when the child is sort of non-speaking, like you say, to be able to say when they're distressed. But again, there are other cues that you can sort of look out for, and we do try to say to both the parent and the child, check that they're happy when they start, when they get sort of engaged in the play, and the child is in every. I've not known a case in this study that I've been physically there in the lab where the child's not being super excited by other toys. They're usually don't even pay attention to us at all. They're just like, all the toy. We have a lot of different toys. They're great. And the child, yeah, it always gets sort of straight into that. To be honest, I've not come across a situation where I could tell that the child didn't want to engage. That's a really good point. Yeah, I think it's something we just have to keep thinking about and keep sort of learning more about. Maybe trying to ask maybe adults who were non-speaking when they were younger or still non-speaking if there are cues that we should look out for, or ways in which we could ask. I think maybe more research needs to be conducted into that.
Yeah, Yeah, really interesting, and it's an evolving thing, isn't it? As you said earlier, research, you know, it is often those reflections afterwards that you think, perhaps if we'd have done this, or so it sounds like there is future steps here. Yeah, watch this space, and Victoria may come back, hopefully with some updates in the not too distant future. So thank you so much.